Mr. President, we currently have the highest federal corporate tax rate in the developed world. Businesses are moving from here overseas to seek a friendlier tax environment. If we are going to compete globally, and we are in a global economy, we've got to have a conducive tax and regulatory environment to do so. We don't have a conducive tax environment now. We cannot compete globally with the second highest or the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world. We also have a tax code that is far too complicated. Taxpayers and companies alike spend about 9 billion hours a year, 9 billion hours a year, complying with IRS requirements, and this costs the U.S. economy more than $400 billion a year. This is just compliance costs. The tax code is full of costly loopholes that allow businesses and millions of individuals to get away with paying no income tax or no corporate tax. After over 30 years, I'm pleased to see the Congress finally getting down to the work of doing a tax overhaul. A few weeks ago, we passed a budget that allows some cuts of about $1.5 trillion. I believe that when we do cut certain taxes, it does generate a greater economic activity, which does in turn mean additional revenue to government. There are limits to that model, however. We cannot simply assume that we can cut all taxes and realize additional revenue. It's important that tax reform comes as well. We've been hearing a lot about cuts, cuts, cuts. If we are going to do cuts, 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 we have got to do wholesale reform. With the national debt exceeding $20 trillion, we've got to take this seriously. Rate reductions have to be accompanied by real reform. We cannot simply rely on rosy economic assumptions, rosy growth rates to fill in the gap. We've got to make tough decisions. We cannot have cuts today that assume that we'll grow a backbone in the out years in terms of the real reforms that we're going to need. We've seen this before. We make the cuts now, we rely on rosy economic assumptions, and then in the out years, if those don't come about, then we forget what we were supposed to do in terms of reform. We can't do that today, not with a debt of $20 trillion, not with a deficit of over $600 billion a year adding to that total debt. So I welcome this opportunity to do tax reform. It is needed. We have to have as I mentioned, a conducive tax and regulatory environment in order to compete. But we have to be realistic as well about what we can achieve. And we can't push off the reforms for cuts today. With that, I yield back.